Hello and welcome to the Career Speakeasy, a casual, fun, and irreverent place to share ideas about career development, the world of work, and life in general. I'm your host and proprietress, Kelly Nottingham. Growing your career should not be boring. So come on in, pull up a chair, and pick your poison.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back. You have sent in your beautifully newly polished resume and application, and you got a call back from a company. You're super excited until it hits you that you are getting ready to have to go for a job interview. Job interviews can be terrifying, but they don't have to be. What we're going to be discussing in the podcast today, and probably in a second one, because as I look through this content that I've pulled together for this podcast, this is a ton of information. So I will probably be breaking this into 2 separate episodes for you, because we've got a lot to cover to help you feel prepared for that interview. So we're going to talk about prepping, what you need to do beforehand, before that interview, to be both mentally and physically prepared. We're going to talk about standard interview questions that get asked a whole lot. We're going to take a look at behavioral or situational types of interview questions, which are all the rage right now, and ways that you can address answering those in the most effective way. We're going to talk about topics to avoid during interviews. And we're going to look at ways that you can really make a great impression by asking questions of them and the types of questions to ask. We're going to take a quick look at body language, clothing choices, and how to deal with the anxiety and stress that come with the interview process, and how to put a bow on the entire process by sending a thank you note to your interviewer. So as I said, a whole bunch of information, and I'd like to start off this podcast by sharing 2 thoughts for you. The first is that it never ceases to amaze me how much people prepare for the job application process by spending hours poring over resumes, spending hours on looking at job applications, researching companies, filling out those applications, sending them off, and then staring at their inbox or their phone waiting for a response. But when it comes to the interview process, people tend to just cross their fingers and jump in without doing a lot of prep work. Preparing for your interview may not be the most exciting thing in the world to do, but this is your chance to really shine. And you've worked so hard on that resume to get the door open for you that you need to be able to walk through that door and absolutely just blow them away with how awesome you are. So that is key number 1. Take the time to prepare for your interviews. And we're going to be talking about different ways to really specifically prepare for these interviews as we go through the next couple of episodes. Number 2. This is a thought that sometimes doesn't occur to people when they're going in for an interview process. They say things like, the company is going to be interviewing me for this job. Here is the truth of the matter. You are also interviewing that company for the job. This is a 2-way conversation that you're going into. And a lot of people miss a great opportunity to find out more about the company and to find out if it's really going to be a good fit for them as far as a job goes by asking questions and digging in to find out more about the company and the industry that you're potentially going to be working in. So as we go through our conversation over the next couple of episodes, I'd like for you to keep those 2 things in mind. Preparation is key, and this interview street is a 2-way street. So let's jump in with being prepared for this 2-way street conversation that you're going to be having by doing a bit more research on the company and the industry that you're applying and interviewing to get into. Now, if you are already in the company and you're applying for a role internally, then you're in great shape. You probably have a major leg up on a lot of competitors. If you're in the same industry but not the same company, you have a little bit of work to do. But again, you're probably going to have a little bit of a leg up on people who are new to the company and the industry. Now, if this is a new company and industry for you, you've never worked in this field before, that's okay. You're going to be able to show off your research capability and your interest in the job by doing some additional research before you go into the interview. Now, I hear some of you already saying, Kelly, we already did research on the company and the industry when we filled out the application and when we worked on our resumes. And yes, you did. If you kept that information in your mind, or if you took notes when you were applying, that's awesome, and you can use that here. This is also why I recommended that you hold on to each individual version of your resume and naming it for the company or the job that you applied for, because it's going to give you a look at the type of skills that you represented that you have to this company. There are lots of other ways to get information other than just looking at the version of the resume that you sent, though. You can look at the job description again, refresh yourself before you go in for this interview so that you remember what job you're applying for. This is especially important if you've been applying for lots of jobs. You may not remember exactly what the title of the job was or what exactly the job entailed at this particular company, so you want to make sure that you refresh yourself on that before you go in for the interview. Look at the company's website. Refresh yourself on that. Look at their About Us section. Look at key pieces of information that they're giving out, their employee value proposition that we talked about in a previous episode. Look at anything that they have about social issues that they're working on, environmental issues that they may be working on, that will maybe give you some context around how that company works. At that point, you can start snooping around a little bit once you get that base information. Snoop around on social media on the company. Go onto if they have a Facebook page, if they have Instagram, if they have official Pinterest pages. A lot of companies will have something listed on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Search through all of those different types of social media to find out what the company is talking about right now, both internally and externally. You can glean a lot of information from what they're putting out there, including directions that the company is going, challenges that they are working to address, challenges that the industry is working to address. This is going to be fodder that you can use when you get ready to go into this interview so that you look like you know what you're talking about, because you do, because you've done some research. You can also go on to websites like Glassdoor.com, where people who have interviewed at companies can share information about the interviewing process. That can kind of give you a leg up sometimes if you aren't sure of what kind of interviewing that the company does. That kind of information can be really valuable. Also, go on to LinkedIn and see if you know people who work for that organization. If you have connections that already work there, pick their brains a little bit about their interview process and about things that are going on at the company that you can maybe ask about during your interview. As you're researching this, take notes. Write down some questions that you have about the industry and about the company so that you are going to be prepared when you go into that interview and you don't have to try to remember these questions off the top of your head. Now, if you're new to the industry, you may want to go onto some industry-wide websites to try to find out a little bit more about the challenges that that industry is facing, some new trends in the industry that you can ask about, and big changes that may be going on right now. So, for example, my most recent corporate role was in the food service industry and in food distribution. And we worked a lot with restaurants. So the National Restaurant Association is one of our across-the-board industry organizations that you can go onto their website and learn about things that are going on within that industry. We talked about it a little bit in one of the resume episodes, but this is really going to showcase the fact that you are not just a bare minimum person, that you are engaging in that industry, you are interested in what's going on in the industry and with that company, and that's only going to sell you as a potential real asset to the company someone who wants to stick around, and someone who wants to help solve problems for that industry. So once you've gathered that information about company and industry, it's time to start thinking about how you're planning to answer some standard interview questions. Now, this is again where a lot of people don't necessarily want to do a lot of prep work because you've been through interviews before and you feel like sometimes it's hard to practice for interviews, but I promise you it is worth the effort. Standard interview questions will sound something like this. Tell me something about yourself. I'm going to go ahead and go on record officially to say that I hate this question. I think this is a useless question because it's not specific enough to really give somebody a lot that they can answer to. So, I could answer this by saying I'm short and I'm redheaded and I have 3 cats and 2 dogs and I like pepperoni pizza. But this is still a question that gets asked quite a bit. Be prepared to talk about maybe your background, your education, what motivates you, volunteer opportunities or hobbies. Make sure that you're keeping it fairly middle of the road. You don't want to scare the normals by telling them that you're into something that maybe a lot of people in society think might be a little bit weird. So keep it polite, keep it high level, and keep it quick. Other questions that you might be getting asked during your interview, things like, why should we hire you? You can modify your professional value proposition to show that you have the qualifications and the experience and that you're a good cultural fit for that company and that job. They'll ask you about greatest strengths and they will ask you about your greatest weaknesses, and that is always one that is tough to answer. You're working during this interview to set yourself apart from the competition by showing how you are a good fit for that job and that company and how you are uniquely qualified to fill that role. When you're asked about your greatest strength, be specific. When you're asked about your greatest weakness, please don't talk about something that you have not yet fixed as far as a weakness. You can talk about a skill that you have worked on improving, something that was a weakness that maybe you've been working to rectify. Whatever you do, do not say that you're too much of a perfectionist. That's one that everybody hears, and it actually can send off some red flags because perfectionists sometimes procrastinate and often have difficulty letting things go. So that may be one of those answers that people tend to fall back on, but perfectionism is not actually a good weakness to list. You may be asked why you are leaving or have left your current job. Stay factual on these questions. If you got laid off, let them know that. If you got fired, you will need to figure out a way to talk about that in a way that doesn't make you look bad, but also does not make the company that you worked for look bad. And this is really key here. You don't want to badmouth your previous employers. Stay positive about them, stay factual about them. You can always say something like, I'm looking for newer opportunities, different opportunities than I had there. You don't want to badmouth your previous employer because it's just like people who gossip. If they're gossiping about someone else, they're probably going to gossip about you. Employers feel the same way. If a company is getting absolutely torn apart by somebody in an interview, the assumption is that that person is going to do the same to the company that they're interviewing with down the road somewhere. They may ask about salary. Now, there are lots of different philosophies on discussing salary during job interviews. You can find good salary calculators online, again, through websites like Glassdoor. Salary.com also can give you an idea of job titles and geographic locations to give you average salaries for that area so that you know that you're roughly within the ballpark. You don't want to necessarily go too high, but you also don't want to lowball yourself because then you could end up getting a really low offer with the expectation that you're going to take it. Now, I have an embarrassing story about this. My first real professional job, I worked at an eye tissue bank, and I had just come out of a lifetime of education. Literally, I had gone through high school, I went straight to college, and then I went straight to graduate school. And this was my first real job after graduate school. I had no clue what people make. And this was before this information was very easily accessible by going online. So I just guessed at what a good salary would be. It was for a nonprofit. This organization was a nonprofit. And when they heard what I said, and then they turned around and then later offered me the job, they actually raised my salary requirement by $6,000 because I had lowballed myself so much that I was far below the minimum for that job. Now, I am now convinced, looking back, that I was probably getting paid the minimum for that job because I had just waltzed on in there and just threw a number down on the table with no way of knowing what an actual salary would be for that type of role. And studies have shown that those early jobs can often set us up for better success financially much longer down the road because we're setting ourselves up at a better salary early on, and then we're going to grow from there. So know your worth, know what a good salary calculator says about your job. My personal recommendation for this, and again, there are a lot of different philosophies on this, but my personal recommendation is make them give you a salary range instead. So if you're not sure what this job would pay and they say, so what kind of salary requirements do you have? You can ask them in response, what is the range that you are looking to pay for this role? And then when they tell you, you can tell them if that's an acceptable range for you. And that gets you off the hook a little bit. There are also times where they may ask you what you made in previous jobs, which is a slippery slope to fall down because you don't necessarily want to keep getting paid the same amount that you were getting paid before. And especially if you're moving into a different industry, you could be taking a major financial risk by telling them what you made in a previous job. So again, you can always ask for a range that they are looking to pay and find out if that is acceptable and let them know if that's an acceptable range for you. Now, another type of question that you may get in your interview are called behavioral or situational interview questions. These are very popular types of interviews right now, and over the course of the past 5 years or so, I've been doing a tremendous amount of training on this specific type of interview process. So these can feel very different to both the interviewer and the person being interviewed, and it is so important to be prepared for these types of questions. So what do I mean by behavioral or situational questions? Instead of asking a question like, why do you want the job? A behavioral or situational question is, tell me about a time when you had to work under high pressure during a situation that was changing rapidly. Or, tell me about a time when you had to work with someone you didn't get along well with. These types of questions are built on the concept that past behavior is predictive of future behavior. So if you have done these things in the past and you can show an example or explain a situation where you dealt with this particular thing, the assumption is that in the future you will deal with it the same way. Now, the reason that this has become a popular way of interviewing is because it's much less hypothetical. When we're asking questions like, tell me about yourself, or why should we hire you, or why do you want this job? The interviewer is asking essentially opinion questions that can't really easily be validated. When you're asking behavioral or situational types of questions, you're really starting to have to share experiences that you have gone through. And frankly, it's a lot easier to start picking up on red flags with people and start understanding behavioral patterns with behavioral situational interviews than it is with those sort of standard hypothetical sorts of questions. I recommend being prepared for at least a few of these questions, if not preparing for the majority of the questions in your interview to be this type of question. A lot of companies use formulaic interview question lists that are based almost exclusively on these types of questions. I'm going to tell a story on my husband, and I only do this because I know he actually doesn't listen to my podcast, so we won't tell him, okay? He went in for a job interview. This was several years ago. And I asked him if it was going to be a behavioral type of interview. And he said, yeah, they told me they would be doing a behavioral interview. And I said, okay, well, let's sit down and start preparing for it. He told me he didn't need to be prepared for it. And I said, are you sure? And he said, no, this is fine. I got this. So I gave him a couple of these example questions. And I said, you feel comfortable answering these without prepping for this interview at all? And he said, yeah, I got this. It'll be fine. Well, he called me right after the interview when he got back in his truck to drive back home, and he said, that was the worst interview I've ever been through in my life. He felt incredibly unprepared, and he could not think of examples in the moment to answer these questions. So this is the next section that we're going to be talking about, is how to answer these types of questions. When you're asked a behavioral type of interview question, your goal is to tell a story of how you dealt with that situation effectively. So one way you can think about this is by using what's called the STAR method. Now you can look this up online. There are a bunch of different places you can go to find out more about this. But here it is in a nutshell. The STAR method is talking about the situation or task that came up that you were required to handle. The A stands for the action that you took, and the R is for the final results that you came out of that situation with. So for example, let's say that you get a question that says, tell me about a time when you had to work under high pressure during a situation with a lot of change. You could answer that with saying something like, at Company X, when I worked there, we were going through a major change initiative in the organization. I was tasked with rolling out a whole new procedure for hourly employees to clock in and clock out. But we were concerned because there was a lot of resistance to changing the system because we had just changed the system a few months before. So what I did was put together a little informational video about the way that this new system was going to be easier for everybody to do. I created a job aid and distributed it out, and did a couple of quick in-person trainings that leaders could come to help them walk through the system so they could help their employees. When the process was changed and rolled out, we had 100% compliance to the new system within 2 days. So what I did there was I gave the situation that was going on. We needed to change to a new system. We had already changed the system previously, and there had been some resistance to it. The task that I was assigned was rolling out this new system. The action that I took, and I listed out the 3 actions that I took, and the result was that we had 100% compliance within just a few days. So this is that story format. You're setting a scene. You're the hero of your story. And you're telling what you had to do to solve the problem, and that the problem got resolved happily in the end. So you can think about this STAR method as you're working through answering some of these sample questions. There are limitless numbers of sites that you can go to online to find examples of behavioral or situational interview questions. Here is my recommendation. Pick out about 10 to 12 of these questions and jot down a story. You can just do little bullet points to answer those types of questions. And here is why. When you get into that interview room, you're not going to know exactly what questions that they're asking. But if you have a good set of little stories with the situation, the task that you were assigned, what you did, the action you took, and the results that you came up with, you're going to be able to answer the vast majority of those questions with just maybe 10 or so examples. You're probably not even going to use all 10 to 12 of them. Make sure that you're coming up with examples about dealing with conflict, communicating effectively, handling stress or high pressure, problem solving, adhering to processes or procedures, and dealing with change. Those are the ones that tend to come up a whole lot with these types of questions. Now, I'm going to tell another story on myself here. When I went to my first behavioral interview, I was told it was going to be a behavioral interview, which was very nice of the person when they scheduled the interview with me to tell me that it was going to be a behavioral interview. And I had never done one before. So I went online and I started researching. And my concern was that I would get nervous in the interview because I was super excited about this job and I didn't want to blow it. So I took a piece of paper and I actually jotted down situations or scenarios, wins from my past work history that I wanted to bring up in that interview. And some of these were also reflected on my resume. So for those of you that have done the work on your resume, you may have some examples already embedded in that resume that you can go ahead and use during this type of interview. But I was so nervous that I was going to forget the examples that I had that I actually took the sheet in with me to the interview. And during the question section, I glanced down and looked at the answer I wanted to share, and then I would share that answer. After the fact, after the interview, when the hiring manager was walking me out toward the front, she asked me what was on the paper. And she said, I noticed that you were looking at it. And I said, well, honestly, I said, I've never done a behavioral interview before. I was nervous about it. And so I researched and I wrote down some examples I wanted to share to make sure that I was really prepared. I was concerned it would make me look like an idiot because I didn't know what I was doing. She told me after they hired me for the job that actually really impressed her, that I took that much effort to do a successful interview and research and be ready for it. So don't be afraid of taking in notes with you. If they ask you during the interview, what are you looking at? Show them your notes and say, I wanted to make sure that I made a good impression. So I've jotted down some things so that I can make sure to bring them up. Now, it's not enough to just write them down, though. My next recommendation, and this goes for any type of interview that you're doing, is to practice saying these little situation and action and responses out loud, either to a friend or to yourself. You need to at least speak them out loud at least a minimum of 1 or 2 times so that you feel comfortable talking about them. Now, I'm not saying that you have to memorize an answer, but just working your way through the words that you want to be able to bring up out of your brain will help you when you get into that interview to not necessarily feel like you're stumbling over your words. So once you get through the questions that they are asking you, it is time for you to ask them some questions. Sometimes when we go into interviews, we get to that end of the interview and we are just so dang relieved that it's over. And the interviewer says, did you have any questions for me? And we say, no. And on the inside, we're saying, hell no, I just want to get out of here. But we really need to take a few moments to ask some good questions because, again, this is where that research comes in that you did at the very beginning of this episode. This is what shows that you are interested in more than just getting a paycheck from this company. You want to invest your time, invest your energy, and invest your creativity in them, and you have put some thought into this. So here are some example questions that you can ask back to your interviewer to make a good impression. Overall, you will notice that these questions are not about you. They're not about the benefit of what you're going to get out of the job. They're about looking for that fit between you and the company and the job. They're also open-ended questions, meaning that they start with what, how, why. There are very few questions on this list that I'm going to read out that are closed-ended or yes or no kinds of questions. We want to get the interviewer talking a little bit so that we can get a good idea of what the job is about, what the company is all about, and it builds trust with that interviewer when you ask questions and really actively listen to what they're saying. So you can ask questions around the job itself. What are some of the job requirements and expectations? What is a typical work week for this role? What are the travel possibilities with this role? What are some other departments or teams that I would be working with if I got this role? You can ask some of those broad organizational questions that we talked about earlier. What are the company's plans for growth? How is the company planning to deal with a lot of changes that are going on in the industry, and be specific about those changes that you researched? How many people are in the department? What is the best part of working at this company for you, interviewer? You can ask about professional growth opportunities. What are the prospects for career growth or promotion within the role? What professional development opportunities exist at this company? And then finish up with some last questions like, is there anything I can clarify about my skills or qualifications? Or, if you want to keep it open-ended, you can say, what can I clarify for you about my skills and qualifications for this role? How soon are you planning to make a decision on the role? And when can I expect to hear from you? Again, jot these down before you go into the interview and be ready to ask these kinds of questions. Now, this is not going to be another half hour added on to the interview. You don't necessarily want to ask a ton of questions, but you at least want to ask, 3 or 4 questions to really show that you're interested in the role, and make sure that you're asking those questions at the end. What can I clarify about my skills and qualifications for this role? How soon are you planning to make a decision, and when can I expect to hear from you? Thank them for the interview and go out and celebrate that you got through that interview. The next day, you will want to send a thank you note to your interviewer. This may feel a little bit old-fashioned, but this is good manners. You can send a thank you note via a card or a letter printed out and mailed, or it's acceptable nowadays to send an email as well. You want to keep this short and sweet. Thank them for their time, express your interest in the role, reiterate very quickly why you're a good choice for the role, and then thank them again and be done with it. You don't want to belabor this and make it too long, but you're essentially just following up to say, I appreciate the time that you took to talk to me about this job, and I am interested in the job. Now, this is easiest if you get a business card from your interviewer, because you want to spell their name correctly. Let me say that one more time. You want to spell their name correctly. If you decide to send a card or letter, that is great. Just be aware that if it is a big organization, your card or letter may get delayed by going through mail. A lot of those big companies, they may have a central mail handling office or department within the company, and your letter or card may get delayed. So it is okay to send an email if you prefer a personal touch, or if you just have that rapport, you get that gut feeling that this interviewer might like an actual card or a letter, you can go ahead and send them that. So make sure to proofread it. If you need to get a friend or family member to look over it before you send it, that's always a good idea. And send it off, and then take a deep breath. So we've still got a whole lot to cover about interviews, and I'm going to save those for another separate episode so that these are a little bit more bite-sized for people. We've talked about a whole lot today. We have discussed prepping for interviews, different types of interview questions, doing research so that you are prepared to ask good questions. And we talked about the 2 key pieces of getting into interview mode, which is being prepared for that interview and remembering that it is a 2-way street. They are interviewing you and you are interviewing them. So now it's time for last call. All right, so in this last call, we have a couple of little assignments that'll take you a little bit of time. The first is to do some research on the company and industry. You're going to come up with at least 3 questions to ask your interviewer about the job, the company, and/or the industry. Next, you're going to prepare to answer the dreaded "tell me about yourself" question. I really hope you don't get asked this question, but it's best to be prepared just in case you do. Again, don't scare the normals on this one. Make sure that you're saying things that are fairly middle of the road that aren't going to cause anybody's eyebrows to raise too much. And then the last piece, I would like for you to come up with and jot down notes for 5 different situations that you have gone through at work that you can share with your interviewer if you get asked a behavioral or situational question about them. Think about topics like communication skills, conflict resolution, collaborative problem solving, process and procedures, and change. And if you can come up with one situation for each one of those, your bases are going to be pretty well covered. You still want to come up with a few extra, but that's a really, really good start. Format your little stories, your situations in that STAR format: situation, task, action, and results, and jot those down so that you're ready. So hopefully this episode has helped you feel a little bit more comfortable with the interview process. In our next episode, we're going to be digging into topics and questions to avoid and how to avoid them gracefully. We're going to be looking at body language, what to wear, how to deal with anxiety in interviews, and what to do on the day of. I look forward to talking with you soon. Bye.
Well, thanks for joining me. If you have suggestions, feedback, or just something random you want to share, email me at careerspeakeasy@gmail.com. And come visit again soon. Cheers!